So welcome very much to our participants and of course to all our panelists who are here today. My name is Christine Allan. I'm the director of CAFOD, which is the Caritas member organisation in England and Wales, and we're one of the sponsoring organisations, as you can see. Our meeting today, Local Leadership of Humanitarian Action, ways forward on engaging national and local faith-based organisations in the context of the Grand Bargain too, and the country level coordination of crisis response. It's a big agenda, but it's a very important discussion to be having at the moment. My co-host, Allan Calma, is here from Lutheran World Federation, and I'd like to him to introduce himself, please.
Thank you, Christine. And as she has already mentioned, my name is Allan Calma, and I'm the Global Humanitarian Coordinator for the Lutheran World Federation. So greetings to all, and nice to see some familiar faces, names, and some old new ones as well. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Allan. That's super. It's great to be with you and to be a double act with you, even though we are miles apart. So today we're going to hear from some amazing speakers and have plenty of time for discussion too. But before we hear from our speakers, Allan and myself would like to be the moderator's prerogative and provide some remarks from our own perspectives to help frame the discussion. So just in terms of housekeeping, as I've mentioned earlier, the translation's available. Do click on the interpretation button and opt for French or Spanish as you see fit. And we've got a chat box and a question and answers box. So feel free to post questions and reflections into these two places during the presentations and afterwards. And we'll be doing our best to monitor these and inviting colleagues to make contributions during the discussion part of the event. It was really important for us as CAFOD and all the other agencies that have co-sponsored this event to convene it today to share perspectives on this really important topic for us ahead of the Grand Bargain annual review meeting, which starts tomorrow. And today is also the day that the Caritas Confederation's Humanitarian Policy Task Force launches a new report called Localization in COVID-19, the experience of Caritas national organisations with humanitarian funding, partnerships and coordination in the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a really important report based on analysis which draws from a survey from 55 Caritas national organisations and further interviews with 20 of those partners. I think we're going to be putting a link to the report in the Zoom chat box, so please copy and paste that and encourage all of you to read it, share with your colleagues and partners, and please do get back to us with your feedback and thoughts. And that report has really helped inform some of our discussions today. I'm not going to attempt to summarise all of the findings. They were incredibly rich and of course some really helpful recommendations. I'm not going to summarise them now, but I want to highlight one point of relevance for our discussion today. It won't be a surprise that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown once again that if international agencies only engage local actors, including national faith actors, when the crises have already happened, then it's leaving it too late. And our analysis points to how the majority of effort on localization now by both donors and the UN agencies and INGOs has really been focused at, well, tweaking at the edges of the dominant model of crisis response. The slogan is supposed to be that humanitarian response will be as international as necessary and as local as possible. Our experience shows that the approach really is still as international as possible and local as necessary. We need to shift that dynamic hugely because it was a promise in the Grand Bargain. This Caritas report notes how throughout the COVID-19 response, we and our partners saw and appreciated how UN agencies did introduce new kinds of flexibility into their partnerships and funding with national NGOs. But over the course of last year, the fraction of funding reaching local NGOs reported through the UN OCHA financial tracking system still remained tiny, just under 1% by June last year. And the portion of that reaching local faith-based organisations was even smaller. So that's why in this Caritas report, we call for a scale-up of support to country-level funding mechanisms and platforms which take deliberate steps towards promoting meaningful leadership by national civil society organisations themselves. It's not just Caritas organisations, it's for across the sector. Now that's just one recommendation in our report. There are others, and I'm sure that we're going to talk about them in this session today. And we look forward to hearing other perspectives and recommendations throughout this event. So I'm now going to turn to Allan, who is going to provide a little bit more context in terms of our current global and country level processes which are relevant to our event today. Over to you, Allan.
Thank you indeed, Christine. And we at the Lutheran World Federation really welcome this new, important and very timely report on localization from Caritas. LWF, being a global communion of 148 churches, have seen the important role FBOs and faith actors, particularly in crisis response, but also in sustainable development. As such, we have been continuously looking for ways to strengthen engagement between our member churches and World Service, which is the international humanitarian and development arm of the LWF, including the recent launch of our guidance note on joint engagement of LWF World Service and member churches. We'll share the link in the chat box later. But this is not always easy. Indeed, there are various global commitments on localization and participation, sometimes with a specific sub-focus on engagement with local and national FBOs. The Grand Bargain work streams 2 and 6 particularly focus specifically on the themes of localization and participation. In 2016, the Charter for Faith-Based Humanitarian Action was also launched at the World Humanitarian Summit. And within the Interagency Standing Committee, there are various processes underway on localization, including a new localization task force, which includes at least one national FBO partner. There's also an upcoming EASC guideline on localization and coordination, which aims to inform the approach by UN actors and others in engaging national and local actors in the humanitarian program cycle at the country level. This includes one subclause reference to faith-based organizations. So, Christine, indeed, there is momentum, particularly in the recent year during the peak of the pandemic. But there's still no consistent or transformative approach either to localization in general or to the engagement of national and local faith-based actors in particular. This is confirmed by the recently published ODI 5-year review on the Grand Bargain, which highlighted that although there is demonstrable progress, a systematic shift in practice is still far off. I should mention as well that in the same ODI report, it highlights 2 FBOs, Christian Aid and CAFOD, as standout for performers in Core Commitment 2.4, and also that the Catholic Relief Services Empower project was showcased as a positive practice example. I would maybe request Howard to share a link to the report in the chat if you'd like to read more. An additional challenge is that there remains a certain level of distrust or discomfort among secular humanitarian agencies or donors in relation to engaging with FBOs or faith actors. For example, even though there is agreement on the positive contributions and real added value in community-based responses, as well as in the shared priorities between other national actors and faith actors, specific challenges often outweigh opportunities when decisions are made in engaging FBOs and faith actors. Today, we have timed our event to coincide with the discussions on the future approaches to humanitarian funding, participations, and coordinations in the Grand Bargain, but we've also timed this to coincide with the startup of the humanitarian program cycle at country level in countries affected by crises. So I really look forward to an energetic and constructive conversation. Over back to you, Christine.
Thank you so much, Allan. Absolutely, and we're not just doing this to show off CAFOD and Christian Aid. These are really important discussions. So I want to now just move to turn to our panelists, and I'm really grateful for these impressive lineup of experts and leaders. So as you can see on the slide, we have Nkese Maria Udongwo, who's the Director of Humanitarian Services for Caritas Nigeria. Unfortunately, Wasim Ahmed, the new Chief Executive of Islamic Relief, has fallen sick today. So we wish him a very speedy recovery, but we're very grateful to Atala Fitzgibbon, who's the Islamic Relief Worldwide's Faith and Partnerships Advisor, who's stepped in at really a moment's notice. We're very grateful for him. We are also very pleased to have Marina Skuric Prodavanovic. I apologize. I've been practicing these names all weekend, but I'm still awful. Who's the Chief of System-Wide Approaches and Practices for OCHA. I'm also very pleased to welcome Stella Ogunlade, who's the Chief NGO and Civil Society Unit for UNHCR, and His Grace Archbishop Buti Joseph Tlagale, OMI of Johannesburg, South Africa. Now, Archbishop Tlagale is traveling from one meeting to his office to join us today. So we're going to be inviting him to share his remarks a little bit later, but we'll start the panel session first with hearing from Nkese from Caritas Nigeria. I'm not going to do a big biography for each of our speakers so that we maximize the time to listen to them. We've made them available on a web page, and the link to that will be posted in the chat box. And obviously we've got quite a lot of speakers, and we want to make sure that we've got enough time for audience participation as well. But first, let's start. Thank you so much. We're kicking off with Nkese. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know, can you hear me well?
We can hear you good.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Nkese Udongwo, just as she has mentioned. I'm the Director of Humanitarian Services, Caritas Nigeria. So Caritas Nigeria is actually a faith-based organization that was established by the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Nigeria to coordinate at a national level the humanitarian and social development interventions on behalf of the Catholic Church in Nigeria. We are also a member of the Caritas Confederation that's joining together with other Caritas in other countries to see how we can actually serve humanity. So in Nigeria, Caritas Nigeria, we are a national NGO, and we work closely with our local counterpart, the Diocesan Caritas, mostly called the Justice, Development and Peace Commissions, JDPCs, in each diocese, wherever it's located all over the country, to carry out humanitarian and social development interventions. And Caritas Nigeria, being a faith-based organization, we try as much as possible to work with local faith leaders, irrespective of the religion, Christian, across the Christian denominations, the Islamic leaders, the traditional rulers, and of course, other faith-based organizations to carry out humanitarian assistance, protection, and other aspects of crisis, even in human trafficking, as well as development and good governance. In the recent past, at least when the COVID-19 pandemic was at its peak in Nigeria last year, we were able to work through funding, mostly from the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Nigeria, the Italian Bishops' Conference, and of course the Caritas Confederation. We were able to get some fundings to intervene on COVID, to train trainers on COVID-19 infection prevention and control. So most of those trained were actually the faith leaders, the religious leaders and also the health and medical directors of faith-based facilities, as well as the healthcare workers. This is so because these people play a leadership role. They played and are still playing leadership role in the COVID-19 preparedness and response. And these faith leaders would also help us, aside from those working in the facilities, to preach, to talk, use their pulpits to talk to people on how to prevent the spread of COVID-19, ensuring that this reaches even to the grassroots, a wider audience, wherever the people are. We also collaborate with national agencies like the Nigerian Center for Disease Control in creating awareness and as well as training other persons on the COVID-19 infection prevention and control. We trained in the northeast of Nigeria, where we've had a protracted humanitarian crisis. We've trained some faith leaders and community leaders on peace building, trauma counseling and healing, and also enabled them, monitored, worked with them to be able to carry out such trauma counseling services amongst the displaced populations and the people returning back to their communities. This actually made a big impact, such that even our diocesan, that's our local Caritas, was able to get a multi-year funding to continue with this work all through Adamawa State. We've also, on the trafficking in persons perspective, which is a huge thing in Nigeria, we've been able to organize at a regional level interfaith conference in Benin City, inviting faith leaders across all denominations and religions, as well as the community chiefs, to expose them on awareness creation on the dangers of trafficking in persons, as well as irregular migration, also encouraging them to use to be able to speak in their areas of influence. As I said initially, we've been able to get funding mostly from the church, from the Catholic Church, as well as from other Caritas member organizations who have been so supportive in enabling us to reach out. We've also been able to get funding from some UN agencies as well as institutional donors in our humanitarian interventions, such as, of course, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, UNHCR, UNICEF, in reaching out as a faith-based organization, because our intervention, we intervene and reach out to people irrespective of their faith, their gender, and their nationality or ethnicity. So we've had lots of good practices in the strengthening of faith-based organizations in Nigeria, in that as a faith-based organization, Caritas Nigeria being a faith-based organization, we actively over the years participated in cluster coordination meetings. We've engaged in joint assessments. We've presented papers that are being adopted even by in the Bay States in implementation. We've also had partnerships with some many UN agencies on project implementation, getting funding for WASH, that's water, sanitation, and hygiene activities, on nutrition, community management of acute malnutrition, and management of stabilization centers, that's treating of infants and young children that have severe acute malnutrition with complications. We've also had funding from UN agencies on protection, child protection, SGBV, border monitoring, livelihoods, as well as social cohesion. Being a faith-based organization, we've not only attacked it on looking at the faith issues, but we actually integrated such that the members of the society can on their own be able to regain their livelihoods, be able to live together, have a peaceful coexistence, and be able to protect themselves from insurgency. We've also, there've been lots of challenges actually for faith-based organizations, as well as other national and local NGOs in Nigeria. One of the principles is the membership of the HCT, that's a humanitarian country team. You have almost zero representative from local or national organization. It's actually dominated by INGOs, UN agencies, and the government. So the local organizations have no voice in decision-making in the HCT. There's also been restriction on the country-based pool funds, which is actually meant for local and national NGOs. In Nigeria, OCHA has actually deliberately favored INGOs in accessing the country-based pool fund. The recent allocation that went out was a consortium allocation, which the INGOs were given preference and were to lead in every consortium and take on the deliberate step of reviewing reports and also training national NGOs, even when national NGOs clearly have better capacity than the INGO that is supposed to be training it. There's also been restrictions on overhead costs for faith-based organizations, especially by UN agencies. I won't actually mention names, and some others that have that allow the overhead cost called partners integrity cost now cut salaries of the local staff and refer us to go to the overhead, the 7% over or 6% overhead cost that has been provided, which now makes a mockery of the entire overhead cost being provided to the national and local NGO. There's also been this growing passive discrimination against faith-based organizations in receiving funding, especially from the UN agencies in Nigeria, in the Northeast. And the Christian organizations are being actively, in fact, passively discriminated against. I take Caritas Nigeria for an example, where we've actually been able to scale through proposal development written that by a UN agency that, oh, we've been successful, we should sign some documents and get back, and they'll get back to us with the partnership agreement. But that partnership agreement never ever came up to date. That's 8 months later. And we've heard from the grapevine that it's because the government, the dominant government in the Northeast being Islamic, has influenced UN agencies not to give grants to Christian organizations. So, yeah.
We could listen to you all day. It's fantastic experience, but I'm gonna have to wind you up. I'm so sorry. Okay. Hopefully we're going to come back to hearing more from you later, but some fantastic points, really important points there, and lots of input to reflect on. And I'm sure lots of people listening to this feeling very, very similar to. Thank you so much, Nkese. We're going to come back to you hopefully in the discussion time. But I need to move on now. So we're going to take all of our panelists and then open the session up for discussion. So please do keep putting your comments in the chat. My next speaker is Atala Fitzgibbon, as we said before, stepping in at the last minute, for which we're grateful. Atala is the Faith and Partnerships Advisor for Islamic Relief Worldwide. So Atala, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christine. And our appreciation really over the last few years to the UN agencies that are trying to make efforts to be more inclusive and to bring in local faith communities. We've been working with a number of them, UNHCR's Interfaith Task Force, WHO, UNFCCC, and of course the Multi-Faith Advisory Council. I think an important point at the beginning is to say that we don't, we share with them many of the same challenges that they face in terms of some of the endemic problems, the structural, what I describe as this sort of structural self-perpetuating cycles or cycle of alienation that has resulted in the current situation we have, which in many ways is rooted in the very sort of northern and deeply secular roots of the humanitarian community, whereby many of those those same sort of values and themes have also fed into a complex range of risks, which have resulted in perpetuating this alienation, such as impartiality, the risks of proselytization, gender, governance models, etc., which make it so risk-laden for agencies, or the perception is that it's risk-laden for donor and larger agencies to engage with local faith-based actors. On top of that, we've got, particularly within the Muslim world, we've got this massive problem of bank de-risking, which is just a sort of overblown risk similar to the other risks, excuse me. But I think the Muslim world also faces some unique challenges in relation to this, in terms of, our historic post-colonial history meant that in many countries, the sort of training of religious leaders, etc., was separated out from the traditional education system, so that they themselves learnt their theology in a sort of vacuum and from the more secular social sciences, and that has fed into this problem of language, whereby humanitarian community will often use language and themes and values which haven't been sort of merged. And a lot of our work over the last 5 years, and my work in terms of policy, has been around how we create a common language, how we can train our staff to engage with local faith communities using a common language, humanitarian language, which means unpacking actually some of the theology around humanitarian response. All of this really points to the huge problem we've had historically, in that the Muslim world has not had much investment into their local faith networks in terms of humanitarian engagement. Perhaps not to the same extent to which the Christian community, for instance, has had from large northern church networks. I mean, our faith communities are structured differently. We don't have these large church networks to enable that either. But those agencies, Middle Eastern and northern agencies, also haven't produced the same level of investment in local communities, and have often followed models of federated or branch development, such as Islamic Relief. We have recognized this issue, as I say, several years ago, and we are making efforts now to, first of all, creating that common language of understanding, so enabling the training of our staff. And many of our staff are trained in secular universities, etc. They're not theologians. How do they relate to complex issues in terms of protection and peace building and development, democracy, all of this? So that has been an ongoing process. We've also produced with Lutheran World Federation some years ago, in 2018, a faith-sensitive guide to humanitarian response, which addressed, how as a community we can address this structurally, and it started off with looking at inclusion of faith communities in common functions such as coordination, assessment, protection, training of humanitarian workers, etc., in faith literacy, and then looking at the core domains such as MHPSS, protection, etc. How do we engage with faith leaders on those issues, and how do we include them, and how do we make them leaders in that? And that itself has been a huge investment, and we've worked closely with other agencies in terms of developing ways of working with faith leaders on protection, for example. And then the third area is social considerations in sectoral domains, such as using faith communities to identify vulnerable individuals. And I think Islamic Relief has always done this well. We've not always been able to invest in local structures and to prioritize that over humanitarian response. But we have been inclusive. For instance, in the Kashmir earthquake, which I actually evaluated, there was tremendous use of faith communities at village level to identify and map communities and their needs. I think also recently we've, in a joint project with Tearfund in South Sudan, called the Bridge Builders, we've proactively developed a model of training local faith actors and FBOs in humanitarian response to address this chasm that exists. We need to scale that up, and we need support in that, and we see ourselves very much as a supporter to others in this. We have had this program called Stride that was developed some 4 or 5 years ago to proactively develop local CBO relationships and capacity in terms of disaster preparedness. And they have stated a commitment to also including local faith actors and FBOs within the range of organizations that they recruit for this program. But I think I'll finish here. I think the overall word I'd leave you with is the need for investment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tal. I really appreciate it. And 6 minutes just really isn't long enough, I know, but thank you so much. Lots of resonance there as well, I think, with some of the points Nkese was talking about, particularly around some of the colonial history. And I do feel that localization is an important contribution to the challenge to decolonize aid. I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, Marina Skuric-Prodanovic, who's the Chief of System-Wide Approaches and Practices at OCHA. Marina, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it was so interesting to also hear the first few speakers, give their takes on localization and faith-based organizations. So I'll start with an uncommon approach, which is disagreeing a little bit with others. So we're not all absolutely in beautiful harmony. So when I was reflecting on what to say today, and I was sort of thinking, about the largest NGOs, and the first thought I had was how many, once I started sort of thinking them through one by one, many of which I've worked for, have a sort of a faith-based principle in either how they were established or how they work, or they continue to have that in their title. And I think that's really interesting, because to me, and I'll disagree with Atala on this, who I have not met until now, but I actually think that really positive aspect of faith imbues the spirit of what we do today. Whether we proclaim neutrality and other humanitarian principles to be what guides us, I think that faith-based aspect really is imparted in what we consider to be our humanitarian approach to humanity. So I think that, to me, that's really incredibly important. And that's an incredibly important, I think, contribution to what we do on a daily basis. And even when you think about movements such as the Red Cross and Red Crescent, where the religious symbol is right there and sends a very powerful symbol, but yet are very much based on humanitarian principles, and indeed we're the ones who actually help bring them about. So just to say that I don't think that it's an alienation. I actually think it helps us also work and gain the trust of those we work with. So that would be just my starting point. So yes, I completely agree with all of you. In some ways it's an exciting period, because we're on the eve of Grand Bargain 2.0. Localization is right up there. I think even more obvious than it was after the World Humanitarian Summit. So clearly there's work to be done, but there's, I think, also much hope. And I think on the ISC side, and I think my colleague Stella, who'll speak later, will speak a little bit about the ISC guidance, but We've had one piece of guidance during COVID, and we've now developed a second piece of guidance on coordination. There'll be one on working with local authorities. So that space is being created, and faith-based organizations are recognized in the guidance as being one of the key contributors and one of the key local actors. So I think those are all good things. I also want to pick up on a couple of things that one of my colleagues said before. So we realized that, you know, the presence of local actors and local coordination is not as high as it should be. And this is one of the things that guides us. And we as OCHA will play a role in tracking the indicators to help us show if there is progress, if there isn't progress, and actually help push that envelope to actually get more participation. So I agree. And I know about the case of Nigeria. But we do have 75% of all humanitarian country teams that do have local NGOs in their midst. And we know that participation overall is about 7%. So that's I think, not high enough, we would all agree. And I think the ultimate aim will be to bring it up to 100, and if the context actually allows that to happen. And this is a whole separate conversation. We also know that the further down you go on the scale of localization, so if you start at a national and you go down to the subnational, and then you end up at a sort of very grassroots level, what we would sort of call as deep field, that participation goes up to 44%, which is probably, it makes a lot of sense. So I think we need to put this into context. And in terms of country-based pool funds, you know, the commitment under the Grand Bargain was 25%. Country-based pool funds have given in 2020 36% of their funding. So again, I think, you know, nothing's ever enough, but I think we are progressing. So we need to recognize that progress. But I was hoping not to speak about financing, because that somehow always loops back into financing. But I wanted to talk about just a couple of, pick up on a couple of issues. So I think the diversity that faith-based organizations bring is really so incredibly important, and bring that diversity of voices. The networks that they bring, and I think we've seen this, and I've personally seen this in places where I've worked in West Africa, in the Middle East. I heard from colleagues in Asia that they're so deeply embedded at the local level in a way that humanitarians never can be. And as my colleague pointed out, you know, we are here today and maybe gone tomorrow. Faith-based organizations are usually there for the long haul. So when we think about what are the advantages, I mean, one of the things that my colleagues have also pointed out to me, you know, beyond the work they do in conflict resolution, and which is sometimes very separate from the pure humanitarian work, they were doing the nexus before we even existed, if we invented the word nexus. And that's really something to think about, right? So in some ways, there is that additional dimension. One of my colleagues I spoke to actually yesterday said, you know what, they're a bit like the hidden tactical nuke of localization, which I found a really interesting quote. Perhaps the word nuke is not something you think and you associate with a faith-based organization, but he did say to me they've operated in such a low-key way for so many years that sort of sometimes eludes the standard humanitarian approach. So that's also something to think about. And then in terms of advocacy, obviously, you know, the networks they bring, the political influence often transcends what we can do through our more classical standard approaches through member states. And so those deep community connections are really incredible. And I remember my own experience in West Africa when church groups were able to raise human rights abuses with the government when none of us standard humanitarians could. So I think these are all critical things. Now, I just want to say it's not all rosy, right? We know some faith-based organizations, and I must mention this because I think we need to put this into context. And colleagues I spoke to also mentioned a number of examples where they receive funding from non-institutional donors to earmark to particular religious groups, which goes against the spirit of what we as humanitarians, you know, stand by. And people point out, beyond the fact that we sort of think this is not, it's incongruent with our principles or the principles we work against, work for, it's also, it does a disservice to the community because it raises often tension, hostility towards the very communities they're trying to assist. And in the end, it's actually, it brings you to a zero-sum game. So for us, I think obviously a needs-based approach is critical, and we appreciate that you know, many of you are doing it. And I was listening to the colleague who was speaking before, and everything she said, I think in terms of participating in coordination structures, participating in needs assessments, participating in various methodologies, is exactly, I mean, I can just replicate what she said because I completely agree with what she pointed out. So I want to just, 3 messages to go. One is we really want to embrace faith-based organizations, and we should. It's a two-way street. We want to embrace them, but they need to want to be embraced. And on this one, I think not everyone feels the same, and some do not engage. So I would just plead with everyone to engage in humanitarian coordination. Humanitarian principles, the principles that really the humanity that drives us all, it must be guided by that. And we have to manage perceptions, and it'll help us manage perceptions of non-neutrality if we don't abide by them. So that's critical. And then the last bit is the complementarity. Let's really see ourselves as working together and being able to really support each other. Your networks will go more deeply and perhaps powerfully in certain places, and ours will go more deeply in others. So I really see that as very much a complementary approach. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Marina. Sorry to have to be so brutal on time, but really lots of really valuable points there, and hearing your perspective. We do recognise the progress, but there's a question of how do we build those challenges together. So some really useful stuff that I think will be very helpful in our discussions after our speakers. We're nearly there. Thank you so much, Marina, for all of that. And our next speaker, Stella Ogunlade, who's the Chief NGO and Civil Society Unit at UNHCR. Really grateful that you could be with us, Stella. So I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, let me just say a very few words on what I was actually expected to talk, which is in my role as the co-chair of the YASC Results Group on localization. And then I would also like to share a little bit my thoughts and experience from a UNHCR side. But in terms of the group, I think, Allan, you mentioned it right at the beginning, we have drafted a guidance note on meaningful participation of local actors in YASC coordination mechanism. We had quite a consultative process for that. We had, for example, the Great Bargain Workstream reviewing it, but also other results group, and more than 100 local actors, local NGOs reviewed the draft in several languages. And now it has been presented to OPAC, who gave us the last red light comments. And I really hope that, you know, by the next week, or at least the week after, we all have it in our hands endorsed. And I think Marina already mentioned that, you know, FPOs are part of it. So just to say, the guidance really focuses on, you know, meaningful participation and representation of local actors. So, you know, they should be part of our humanitarian country teams, of our clusters, of our working groups. They should get any support they need to be able to attend, whether it's interpretation, whether it's logistical support, whether it is having the right information, having the right induction in how, you know, our coordination mechanism work, which is not always obvious, but also having leadership roles. So, you know, really a recommendation to consider them as co-leads, for example, where it is possible, because we do realize it context specific, but where it's possible for clusters, for working groups, you know, and maybe have some rotational basis where they can take this leadership roles or the membership roles, and we ensure that we have a fair and transparent process how we select them. It also has a part on capacity strengthening, and here I would really emphasize that it's a two-way approach. So we don't always want to talk about us training them, but we should also talk about them training us, particularly when we come in a completely new operational context that we might not be very familiar with. But also we should go away from, you know, one-off workshops and more into, you know, training, mentoring, you know, coaching, peer-to-peer support, and so forth. And then we have a chapter on visibility. So make sure that what they do is recognized, is visible to donors, to medias, and so forth, not always the UN and INGOs. Let's ensure that they're really included from the start, from the preparedness to the response planning, including humanitarian response plans, to the nexus and development peace collaboration. And finally, the resourcing for coordination. So the guidance is not really talking about funding, because we do see that the Great Bargain has been working and will continue to work on that. It is really more to still highlight that, you know, for local actors to be able to participate in coordination mechanism, they also need funding, for example, staffing and so forth, to be sitting with us at the table. So when we look now at the future of the Great Bargain, I really hope that this is something, you know, you will also look into in terms of implementing the guidance that we have. So now to the future is now to really, I mean, of course, monitor the implementation. We have some indicators for all those recommendations, and OCHA gratefully agreed to help us, you know, with the implementation monitoring, but we will also look into targets later on. Right now, we wanted to really have a baseline data first, but, you know, maybe we will get more concrete later on. And we now have invited 8 members from different regions, local NGOs and NGO consortia, including an FBO, Caritas Venezuela, to join us, where we continue to work now on further measures of localization, including the dissemination of this guidance. So maybe stop there. We also have an online information repository if you're interested on Relief Web to see more what we've been doing and the guidance we have and the case studies and so forth. And then maybe, Christine, if you allow me, I would just like to say a few things about UNHCR. So, you know, as UNHCR, I think we have appreciated working with FBOs, particularly at operational level, for a very long time. This is particularly, and I think predecessors mentioned it, because we see their strong role in advocacy. You know, they're really people who can influence multi-stakeholders, whether it's local governments, whether it is, you know, communities, local authorities, and, you know, respecting human rights, even if they come with the script and they use other words, but they can have a strong impact. They can have a strong impact in addressing xenophobia and discrimination, for example, of refugees. They can help to really establish peaceful coexistence on the ground. And they have access to areas that we don't even have access to for different reasons. So these are all things that we really, really appreciate. And I think it came out again, like you already said at the beginning during COVID, the outstanding role that, you know, they had in being local responders on the front line, also in terms of mental health, you know, of refugees, IDPs, and other you know, persons, as we call it, of concern to us. So we do appreciate this. I think we had in 2011 NGO consultations on faith and protection that resulted then in the dialogue of the High Commissioner in 2012 on faith and protection, and then again resulted in the Welcome Stranger affirmation that were, by the way, signed by more than 1,500 local FBOs and faith communities, and by a partnership you know, note that gives further guidance on how to better engage with faith actors. And at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, the High Commissioner and the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, as well as the Emergency Relief Coordinator, they met with 12 directors of different faith-based organizations and consortia to discuss how we could better work together. And the kind of revitalization of Welcome the Stranger affirmation came out of it, as well as, you know, providing much more visibility of what, you know, FBOs also do on the local ground, on localization, and also particular mental health. So, you know, bringing all this together led to us to establish a task team that I think was mentioned by Atala, to see, you know, first of all, how can we follow up and provide more visibility for the mental health aspect, which we did with some social media products also on World Mental Health Day, but even to go beyond and really see how we can, you know, like I said, revitalize Welcome the Stranger, work much more stronger on advocacy together, work much more stronger on local level together. How can we give guidance? And so we have some sort of planning that we're doing. And maybe just to say there, one thing that I mean, the hope the task team is guiding us as UNHCR, also better to learn how to work with them. And coming back to what Marina said, we also have a lot of prejudices because we see we are independent and we are worried that they might not be neutral. But, you know, many are, and many have shown that they can support many different groups of different faiths. And I think Nkese mentioned that right at the beginning. So we need to learn this a little bit better. And we also started with training for our staff on the role of religion in conflict, because I think in local faith communities as well as international FBOs, they can really, help us to better understand, why there are certain conflicts, which helps our need assessment, and how we can reach out to different groups to better work with them in the response.
Thank you, Stella.
So, yeah, that's it. That was my last sentence, Christine. Over to you.
That's super. Thank you. I hate this job. No, it's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And lots in the chat being picked up in terms of welcoming stranger and everything. That's absolutely super. Gosh, our inputs this afternoon are absolutely incredible. So thank you so much to everybody, especially you, Stella. Sorry to cut you off. So I'm now very pleased to welcome His Grace Archbishop Uti Joseph Tlagali of Johannesburg, South Africa. So Archbishop, please do share with us briefly your reflections. And as you've heard, I have the terrible job of cutting people off when it comes to 6 minutes or thereabouts. So Archbishop, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Perhaps one should start with what we're currently doing here. And I'm talking about here in South Africa, Southern Africa, including Botswana and Swaziland. We have established Caritas South Africa. Before, I don't think we're really that organized, but now we've established Caritas South Africa. And at the same time, we have also in recent years established a migrant refugee desk. And I happen to be the liaison bishop of migrants and refugees at the Bishops' Conference. And so the two organizations work together. I think in future we'll have to decide which way to go. But for now, for example, with regard to the migrants and refugees, we're trying to establish in every parish a contact person, a contact committee that is part of the parish council. The reason for wanting to have direct contact with parishes is because when there are xenophobic eruptions in South Africa, it always happens at community level. And it always happens when there is a delivery service protest. And that's when people take out their anger on foreign nationals or migrants or refugees, so to speak. And we are saying perhaps one way of attacking this problem is by having direct contact with people at community level who become involved in attacks on other people, so that at community level, you can have beyond your own parish, we can begin to create a network of people who are interested in migrant refugees affairs in that community, so that when there's a problem, you know whom to talk to. And to try and create a platform, try and bridge the gap between locals and migrants by creating a dialogue platform. So that's the aim at present at which we're working. Both desks for migrants and charitable, or the Caritas desk, they are both cooperating and involved in social and spiritual care provided for migrants and refugees. But we also try and provide legal services. There's a huge number of migrants in South Africa, and quite a large number of them do not have proper documents, ID, identity cards, etc. And so we have developed a legal desk that manages to contact other lawyers in other cities in the country, where they try and help people who have needs of documentation, and they are also in charge with legal fraternities that offer pro bono services. We also try and work, let me see now, I'm not sure how to put this. We're trying to develop a good relationship with Home Affairs. For example, on the 20th of June, or whenever we celebrate the Refugee Day, we do that jointly with the Department of Home Affairs. It might sound strange, but the reason for that, our conviction that it's good to work with the Department of Home Affairs, because then we begin to know the people directly who handle cases of migrants, and therefore can always appeal to them where there are cases that we are unable to handle based on that good relationship which we're trying to create with the government. On the other hand, apart from the work done by Caritas and the Office of Migrants and Refugees around the country, it's still a work in progress to try and build a tight network of people with whom we can work. We meet once a year with representatives of, not only representatives of Caritas and migrant desk, but also with other NGOs of the migrant communities. They too have their associations, and we also try and meet with them so that there's a kind of a growing synergy amongst us all. I'd also like to mention the fact that we work with, in South Africa here, with a Motsepe Foundation. The significance of this foundation is that it calls, well, twice a year, all religious leaders, Muslims, Jews, indigenous religious leaders, any Orthodox churches, etc., any group that you have, a religious group in South Africa, they are all participants of this group, which is amazing. I doubt if you have anywhere else where you have all religious groups from different strands of their beliefs who meet together every year. And this has been happening for several years now. One of the things Motsepe Foundation does is to provide funding for the different projects that are taking place in the different religious organizations. The Motsepe Foundation also works with traditional leaders. There are traditional leaders, there are chiefs. Any rural area, there will always be a local chief there. And all of them are involved in this foundation. And both, therefore, the traditional leaders meet with the religious leaders about and support each other in the projects they do at the local level. It's been an amazing effort in the sense that each group actually applies for funding and gets funding. It would be nice if some of one of the things that could be developed in time is to try and supplement, first promote local donors, because there are people who run foundations here who could support all these projects, bring them on board so that they can support those projects, and then interest international donors to work with these groups so that they can strengthen the local contributions and efforts which local groups are doing. Finally,
thank you. Oh, sorry, finally, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say that finally, of course, we have a challenge here in South Africa, yet we're still very much caught up in the past, in the inequalities of the past in terms of wealth, in terms of relationship between men and women, and something new, of course, that has come up as a result of democracy, the corruption that is found everywhere. So these are some of the challenges that still have to be faced head on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Archbishop. That's really great and really fascinating to hear that reality of the local contexts and the breadth of coverage. Wow, what an amazing collection of different inputs. Allan, you've got a real challenge of a job, because I think you were going. The intention was you'd try and kind of facilitate our conversations. So let's hand over to you, Allan. We've got some good stuff in the chat already.
No, thanks, Christine, and thanks to the panelists. I think the discussions have really ignited a lot of discussion in the chat box, as you can see. But maybe before we proceed to the questions, and I will be asking our panelists to respond to some of the specific questions. But maybe before that, I've received a request for some of our participants coming from local churches and faith organizations to actually give a bit of inputs into the discussion. So maybe I would start by inviting Gulliver Ismail, the director of the Sudan Evangelical Mission. Are you online with us, Gulliver? If you can please unmute yourself and maybe give us a quick intervention as an input to the discussion. Yes, and maybe if I could again request that we keep it brief, maybe 2-3 minutes maximum, please, Gulliver. Over to you.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. My name is Gulliver, as I've already introduced. Yes, I work for Sudan Evangelical Mission, a national NGO that is working in South Sudan. We have carried out humanitarian work in South Sudan for several years, and the same values collaboration, and has established and maintained the long-lasting partnerships with a range of stakeholders, including international NGOs, donors, and government counterparts. Briefly, our observations in the country that we work in is that although the UN agencies in South Sudan are open to collaboration with faith-based partners, we have observed that they tend only to include international faith-based NGOs and not paying much attention to national NGOs who are faith-based. For example, during the coronavirus pandemic, which broke out last year, there was kind of no effort from the UN agencies to seek direct partnerships with the faith-based leaders or national local faith-based NGOs. So that has been a bit of a challenge. We had to look for other alternatives for funding to support our interventions in the country. The same case when the flooding, which happened in most parts of the country last year, that was also a challenge. We have also seen that there was a little effort to work directly with faith-based NGOs. In the country, faith-based NGOs are diverse, as we already know, and are motivated by their faith to play a vital role of delivering a wide range of services. They include areas like health, education, food security, peace building, mediation, reconciliation, as well as humanitarian relief. Also, they play a lot of role in issues of influencing and access at times in some cases. And if faith-based NGOs are also in most cases of pandemic or emergencies that the first responders, and they are usually driven by solidarity, compassion, and deep understanding of the local context. So we have capacity to reach most of the areas in the country, and we have very extensive networks within with the local churches. So I think our recommendations, as we see, would like to see that the UN and the donor agencies should recognize and see faith-based NGOs as unique stakeholders in humanitarian or development work, because they are already focal points in the local communities that we operate in. And secondly, we also want to see a range of that there's a range of capacities with faith-based NGOs, and we encourage UN and the donor agencies to review their model of operation in humanitarian and development work to enable partnership with the faith-based NGOs. Thank you.
Thank you, Gulliver. That was very, very concise and quite clear, the recommendations at the end. I also got a request from Colombia, from Funco, Colombia, but I'm not seeing. Are you online with us, Ruth Camargo? Do you see Ruth, Howard, by any chance? Sorry, I don't have.
I'm not seeing her on. I think she dropped out. So if she can message my Howard, what CAFOD. Oh, is that? I'm seeing Loida Carriel. Let me just. Okay. I think registered under a different.
Under a different name. I think she's under Loida Carriel. So
just adding her in to be able to speak.
All right. So for those who can't speak Spanish like I do, let's go to the translation, please. Over to you, Ruth. Ruth, you have to unmute yourself. Oh. Ruth, can you please unmute yourself because we can't hear you? there's no option to unmute. Would you be able to mute her? I think that's what I thought that means. Yes. Okay, maybe while we're working on that particular aspect, maybe I should just go through the chat box a little bit while we work on that one. As you can see, there's been a lot of different questions, but maybe we could start with something addressed to, maybe we could address this to Atala. Atala, one of the participants, Niall from ACT Alliance, was actually asking, in your opinion, do you have any particular advice on what we could collectively do as faith-based organizations to counter perceptions in terms of impartiality, proselytization, and on gender? Atala?
Thanks. Sorry. Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think perhaps my earlier reference to the Red Cross Code may have been misunderstood. I'm not saying it's in conflict with faith. I'm saying that essentially people of faith need to be able to understand it from their own faith tradition when we're talking about impartiality and proselytization. And one of the first things we did as an agency when we joined the Red Cross Code back in the 90s was actually we did a paper around Islamic teaching in relation to all these principles and values. And I think that is one of the contributions that agencies such as Islamic Relief, ACT Alliance, networks, etc., have, is that we are in some way an interlocutor, an intermediary between these quite sort of opaque language which won't be understood necessarily easily, because how can you explain to somebody of faith, well, you shouldn't be telling them about your faith when it seems inherent in their own faith teaching that you do so. So these are complex areas, and this is one of the areas, for instance, Islamic Relief engaged within the development of its own work around understanding humanitarian approaches in Islam. And so that's, you know, perhaps collectively we need to do something around that, around bigging that up, around perhaps collectivizing it. But I think we all have extremely important roles within our own communities to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Atala, for that one. As you can see, some of the earlier questions as well in the chat box were concerning funding. So this one's I'm just mentioning if any of the panelists would like to comment on it. Adrian was mentioning that a rule of thumb should be the grassroots could get funding directly. Maybe around 80% should go to the grassroots level and around 20%, you know, like either regional proxies or headquarters or whatever, but at least 80% should be going to the grassroots levels. There was a question on the figure of 36% that Marina mentioned earlier, but I've seen that she's already responded in the chat box. So please have a look at that one. If you're interested, she's provided a link as well. There was a comment on capacity strengthening. And here maybe either Marina maybe or Stella could respond to. Corey was asking, there are many local faith actors who currently don't have the capacity or understand how to implement humanitarian standards at the moment, but they would like to develop this. So the question is, to what extent can humanitarian funding be spent on such learning processes among local actors? Would either you, Stella, or Marina be able to respond to that? I know Marina mentioned she doesn't want to talk about funding, but...
No, I'm happy to speak about funding because it seems to always come up and it's an important issue. Obviously, you know, you can't, I think we've concluded you also can't do coordination without being funded. You know, it's very well to have principles, but you actually need to foot the bills too. So completely understood. So on country-based pool funds, I think I've put the link, and I think there the figures are not. They can be improved, but I think they're much better than they were even 3 years ago. So I think that, as I said, already gives hope. On the suggestion on 80% of grassroots organizations should receive funding, I mean, I want to put this into context. So, you know, I think today is the day where I'm being a bit contrarian. But first of all, I think the point, I mean, localization is incredibly important, and I first want to start with that, because I'm not going to now say localization is not important. The primary thing is not to have localization for the sake of localization. We're doing it because our primary aim is to get assistance as efficiently, as sustainably, as quickly as we can to people who need it. I mean, let's keep our eye on the primary aim. And for me, this is the primary aim. And perhaps people around this discussion have different primary aims, but to me, as a humanitarian, that is the thing that guides me. Getting that assistance to that woman in wherever she is, who needs to have food for her children, is what I really want to aim to do. And I think on that, the delivery by grassroots organizations also has its limits. And this is not to say that, I think, you know, we can have a long discussion on intermediaries, and that actually a lot of funding does go to local NGOs, but through intermediaries. We know many of the pitfalls on this road. We know the risk aversion of donors. We could go on and on. But I think the ultimate thing is also recognition that everyone plays the role. I don't think a grassroots organization can necessarily run a large-scale program or mobilize a large plane load within 24 hours, which some large organizations do play that role, and that is the role they play best. I can also see grassroots organizations being able to do many things that large organizations can't. So I'm really against explicit percentages, and even commitments, you know, are difficult sometimes to maintain. It is really about the most appropriate response that will get that assistance most quickly. And so if you want me to be really honest, I think 80% is not going to help us get there, but there may be contexts where actually most of the response needs to be implemented by grassroots organizations for a whole variety of factors. So I just suggest a little bit of balance. And on capacity strengthening, absolutely. I think lots of need. This keeps on coming up. We keep on hearing it from local partners, and I couldn't agree with you more. And the issue is always how we're going to do this and who's going to fund this, and really to get the donors to fund it. Back to you, Allan.
No, precisely. And thank you, Marina. Indeed, like we all have different roles to play, and I think choosing one over the other might be a bit of an overstretch. But Stella, I see you turn on your cam. I'm assuming you wanted to share a bit, or?
No, I think Marina really, said it well. I mean, I would also agree that when we talk about localization, that sometimes it's also context specific. I mean, we should not forget that there's sometimes very sensitive countries. For example, I worked in Sri Lanka a long time ago, where, you know, we also expose local actors, and we're exposed to much bigger risk than us. And sometimes it's good for international actors to provide protection by presence. So, so just to say, maybe just an overall number is not going to be applicable for each context.
Indeed, Stella. And since I saw you, I just remember that there was a comment in the chat box, liking what you mentioned about let us really ensure that they are included from the start, meaning the faith actors. So there was a specific question for you again, Marina. It's asking that whether henceforth that the global humanitarian response plans would actually include faith actors already from the very beginning. Apparently there was a question that in the COVID-19 GHRP, it wasn't mentioned at the beginning, although it was there in the edited version.
So honestly, I'm afraid to say I was not involved in a blow-by-blow process of putting together the GHRP. I think the GHRP, as the GHO, suffers from the drafting by committee, that everyone wants to have their bit reflected, and in the end, if you want to make it a readable document, some things do get cut. I think noted on the subsequent inclusion of faith-based organizations, and I already sent a text, actually, when I saw that comment, I already sent a text to the colleague who's going to be working on the GHO. Please keep this in mind. I'm not promising, I'm not the editor of the GHO, and there will be no more GHRP, I think, next year. But definitely noted that, you know, we need to have different angles, but sometimes in the attempt to cover many angles, sometimes some get dropped. But and obviously this was rectified. I'm very glad that it was, and we will keep it in mind. And I just ask colleagues to continue engaging with the teams who consult with you on the drafting.
And indeed, we all need to continue helping each other to keep on pushing. Just a point, maybe this one I could refer to just very quickly to Nkese. There's a comment that in the name of strengthening localization, sometimes INGOs actually control all the affairs of local NGOs and resource allocation, engagement of staff, SOPs. I think a lot of INGOs are quite particular in ensuring that local NGOs are also given that certain level of independence and trust. But I think this also does happen. Do you have any feedback on that? Does this reflect your realities on the ground in Nigeria? Or sometimes INGOs can be too prescriptive, because we always say the UN and the donors are quite prescriptive, but sometimes we as INGOs could also be are also what's the word? We also do this sometimes.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you can hear me. So you can hear me? Okay. So well, it's not a one size fits all. There are some INGOs that are very good in their partnership principles, actually implementing good partnership principles, while there are some that don't really walk the talk. And then many of because as Caritas Nigeria, we have built our systems and our institutions to be strong. And we also try to collaborate. Sometimes we proactively reach out to sister agencies when we want to develop some policies, so that we can put together, make our policies adapted to fit our local context and what we are doing. So our policies are pretty standard, and so much of that does not really apply to us, even though there are still some INGOs, I would say, even in Nigeria, that are very prescriptive. Despite the fact that you have all those things they still want to control. And I wouldn't, it would not be fair to just say INGO. I would say it is the staff on ground. So it's, I think the headquarters INGO should continuously reorientate their staff on good partnership principles, on the principles of localization, and ensure that what they actually said they would do is being done on ground. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I think that's really excellent. Basically, there are no further questions in the chat box that I could see. There is a lot of resources there, so please take the time to skim through it and get all of this important resources coming from Christian Aid, IRW, Caritas, from us in LWF. There's a study there from Caritas Bangladesh as well, and Christian Aid Bangladesh, which you can actually see. All right. We have 8 minutes left. Time really flies, Christine. What are we going to do? So, yes, Christine.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, we did think that it would be quite useful to show a very quick poll, and maybe we could still do that, Howard, if you've got it set up still, and then go straight into the final comments from exactly. our panelists. So you've got on your screen a participant poll. Panelists and hosts can't vote, so this is for you, for our attendees only. What are the most important challenges for local faith actors when they engage with international humanitarian agencies and coordination responses? So please just you can check as many of those, I think, as you want. And then scroll down to the second question. What do you think are the most interesting ways forward to strengthen engagements of local FBOs in humanitarian action? If you're a panelist, you're not going to be able to vote. This is just for the attendees. So please do check, and this is to give us a sense of a temperature check. So please do, please do your poll now. I think another 10 seconds or so, Howard, before how are we doing in terms of participants?
I think maybe another 10 seconds or so. Yes, so participants, you should see a poll has popped up as a sort of screen, and you have 2 questions, and you can click against And I think you can vote for multiple options, but the idea is we just want to see what are the biggest challenges that you think are most important to address, and then also what do you think might be some of the most interesting, positive ways forward to address the challenges. And both the challenges, in the first question about challenges and the second question about ways forward, these reflect some of the findings in the Caritas report on localization and local leadership of crisis response that was mentioned, and we'll post again the link to that report so you can read that in detail after this. But these are some of the ideas from that. So it's just interesting to see where's the mood from the participants here.
Yeah.
So maybe, yes, we can move on to the ending the polling and have a look at where the...
Let's see what the reactions are, and then we will come back to our panelists for a final kind of quick response there. So really interesting in terms of...
It's quite close.
The response, yes.
The scores. Yes. I think the issues are quite, yes.
I think that does sum up the importance of how these points actually fit together. And again, the higher level, particularly there, the multi-year investment is a really key point that coming across sort of as our winner from the last one. So sorry, Marina, it does come down to not just the money, but the way in which that money is done, quality of funding available, and multi-year investment being the two kind of lead responses. So gosh, thank you all so much. I think, Allan, we're going to ask each of our panelists just for a quick kind of 1 minute sort of reflection to finish us off with, if that's, is that me or is that you? I've lost my way.
We can call on them. Maybe you can just, just go ahead, Christine.
Great, thank you very much. Archbishop, I'm going to go backwards, actually, I think, Archbishop. So I'm going to start with you, if I may, to give any final, from this discussion, a final kind of minute or so of reactions or a final comment that you wish to share. Thank you.
Yes, I would say between locals and international donors or groups, there should be an ongoing dialogue so that the different perceptions are brought into harmony, or that people begin to appreciate each other's concerns. I don't think there's enough dialogue going on. I think if you created that kind of platform, that would help. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good point to finish with. That's really valuable. And Nkese, I'd like to ask you next, if I might, just your final kind of like minute reflection. Thank you.
Sorry, I was trying to put on my. Okay, so final reflection would be to encourage complementarity and subsidiarity, especially being promoted by the UN agencies in engaging faith-based organizations, and also to favor real partnerships over subcontracting. And also for the donors, multi-year funding, especially for humanitarian response to national and faith-based agencies is really important, as most times we are just left with baby in the hand once the 6 months or 1 year funding is off, and it actually negatively impacts on the beneficiaries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nkese. Really valuable points there. Atala, can I come to you next, please?
Yes, thanks. One of my reflections is that I think one of the important things in terms of how faith communities perceive us is the power of what they see as the partnerships between the agencies that are dealing with this behind the scenes. So if they see sort of interfaith relationships, such as we've had some extremely meaningful ones, for instance, with Tearfund in South Sudan, and with LWF in Kenya and elsewhere and in the Middle East. This actually is extremely powerful in terms of how faith communities then perceive their own possibilities around breaking down barriers, and particularly when we're able to speak with that faith literacy that manages to marry humanitarian values and faith. And I think finally, I would say none of this is going to be easy. It is not easy. We are looking at an enormous challenge of rolling this back. But I do believe that if we can work with colleagues like Stella and Marina, etc., and develop a long-term commitment and plan to do this through working not only with our own staff in changing, conscious and unconscious bias, but also local faith communities. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Atala. I think some very important lessons for us to learn, which was very much the gauntlet, as it were, that the challenge that Marina put down to us. Marina, what's your final kind of reflection that you'd like us to take away, please? Thank you.
Okay, it's really hard to find one. To Ole, I agree that these are the values that drive us, and to his comment in the chat box. But I'm still maintaining that the aim is to deliver assistance, but I agree on the humanity and the dignity completely. Coordination and decision-making are super important, as your poll has shown, not a first runner-up, but at least a second or third. I see guidance to the question on Venezuela. Nobody can force anyone to do anything, but once the guidance becomes guidance, which it will soon, then it gives us something stronger to lean on. So hopefully we'll be able to push the envelope. And to His Grace, absolutely, I agree with you on the dialogue. The dialogue is the essential part. Back to you, Christina.
Thank you so much, Marina. Absolutely great summary there. Thank you. And Stella, could you do us our final panelists to share some short reflections?
Thanks. Now, maybe just again to continue from what Marina said, I think dialogue, yeah, but guidance as well. Is important. Mutual trust building is very important. And I just wanted to also say, we have established a multi-religious council of global faith leaders, where we also want to work with faith leaders on, on humanitarian responses, on key messages and so forth. So I think this kind of multi-religious approach might also help, if you're seeing different global faith leaders coming together and having the same key message, if you're seeing different FBOs coming together and doing the same, a great work, maybe that also has, an impact on the ground. And maybe last thing is, I think it's very important to map all the good practices. We have so many, good examples of how it works at local level and higher. Maybe we should, more come together and bring that together and share that in order to guide us for the future. Over.
Thank you very much, Stella. Allan, I was just wondering if you had any final thoughts or reflections as well that would be really helpful to help us end.
Yeah, no, I think there's the objective of this particular webinar discussion is basically to identify how do we engage more with local faith actors, national and local faith actors, when it comes to humanitarian crisis. And I think this discussion has just proven that there are already good practices. There are certain advances that we've come, like from even comparing to a couple of years ago. I think we've made significant advances since that time, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I think there's a lot of issues that have been raised here in terms of misunderstanding, misperception, and also expectations from each other in terms of how do we do effective humanitarian or crisis response. A few things that I would really want to pick up from what the speakers have mentioned. I think this whole issue about engaging on the basis of mutuality and not instrumentality, I think that is really something that we need to sort of like try to think about how do we effectively implement that, moving away from as local as necessary to really embracing a rights-based empowerment approach. I think that is something that I would really like to take in. And participation, I forgot who mentioned it, but engagement is a two-way process. I think it was either Marina or Stella who mentioned it. And I think this is particularly true. It is two-way, but for the local and national NGOs and faith-based actors, I think it's important to identify this need to ensure resourcing, to ensure that coordination happens and there's sufficient capacity strengthening for them to actually do what is expected of them. I think that's. But from my side, it had been such an interesting discussion. Thank you so much to the panelists. I think we at the LWF would like to look at this as not as the end result, but really as a beginning of more in-depth discussions on this topic. Over to you, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allan. And it just comes to me to say a massive thank you to you, my co-host, who's done it brilliantly, and all of our panelists. It's been absolutely brilliant. I really appreciate all the time and the thought and the input that you've given to us, and the chat, all of you who have participated in today's session. It's been incredibly valuable. Please do have a look at the chat. We're not going to close it down just yet as soon as it's finished, but do have another look through the chat box to see that. As others have said, dialogue and the way forward, we've got to learn from one another. We've got to challenge ourselves as well as challenging other people and taking the responsibility. So really, really fantastic kind of things to think about. I just want to finally end where we began, which is reminding us of the timing that we have for this moment and the grand bargain rethink and the evaluation. It's a really important time, and thank you particularly to Marina for joining us today in relation to that. And also the launch of the Caritas localization report, which is really excellent and flags up a number of the points that we have been discussing today. And we all take on board that we are in that dialogue, on that journey. We have a long way to go, but we have lots to learn from what we've done right as well as what we've not done right, and we just continue to move forward, knowing that at the end of the day what we want to do is to achieve that humanitarian input, but make sure that it's locally owned, locally led and locally delivered. Thank you all so much for participating in today, and take care everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.
Bye.